We think that, well, we'd love for the police to understand the communities they work in, to work together with communities to solve community problems. But ultimately, what tools do police have to solve our community problems? They have guns and handcuffs and ticket books and tear gas. These are not the tools our communities need to address very real problems that they face. Police don't have access to housing, affordable health care, drug treatment services, community-based mental health services, well-functioning schools. They don't have any of that. But these are the resources that communities really need to be safe and secure. So how did we get into this mess? Well, we've seen how the Nixon administration dreams up the war on drugs, but why did Democratic big city mayors go along with this plan? Well, in part because they were invested in the politics of neoliberal austerity. And by this, I mean a kind of capitulation under the pressures of global competition to the idea that the only thing local government could do was to push resources up the economic ladder through tax breaks and subsidies in hopes that those at the top would become so wildly successful that some of that wealth would trickle down to the rest of us. But that's not what's happened. What's happened over that period is the rise of mass homelessness, mass untreated mental health and substance abuse problems, mass involvement in black markets of drugs and sex work and stolen goods by those who have no real access to the formal economy, failed schools, failed inadequate youth services. And this has produced exactly the problems, mostly in poor communities of color, that have then been turned over to the police, not to solve, but to put a lid on, so that politicians can continue to make their downtown real estate deals and organize their tax subsidies in return for campaign contributions. And ultimately, this is where we have to focus if we want to address the problems of racial disparities in policing. The police didn't create the war on drugs. They didn't defund schools. They didn't dismantle mental health services. These were political decisions. And we can't fix those decisions with implicit bias training, de-escalation training, mindfulness training, body cameras, or all the rest. The officers who were responsible for the death of George Floyd had had implicit bias training, had had de-escalation training, had had mindfulness training, were wearing body cameras, were operating under a new use of force policy that emphasized sanctity of life, who were required through new training and policies to intervene if they witnessed officer misconduct. And none of it made any difference. These police reforms are not going to address the ways in which policing reproduces racial inequality in the United States. At the same time, it's a mistake to think that if we could just defund the police, that this would fix the problems of racism in American society. When we look back on the protests of the 1960s, the uprisings, the riots, most of which were triggered by police behavior, we're pretty clear now that this was not just about policing. This was about the demand for a broad addressing of racial inequality in American society. And that is exactly the way I think we need to understand the moment we're in right now. While the focus out on the streets is very much on the abuses of policing and the need to shift resources away from policing and into community identified public safety priorities, there continue to be major structural and institutional forces that reproduce racial inequality in American society. And part of the challenge of the moment we're in right now is not just to fix policing, but begin that hard work of looking at these deeper structural and institutional factors that are reproducing racial inequality.